Americans in 1841 welcomed the publication of Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan by John Lloyd Stephens, with illustrations by Frederick G. Catherwood. The two explorers had visited the region in 1839 and 1840. This work not only recounted Stephens and Catherwood's travels to the region, but also described for the first time many of the ruins found there, which were new to most English readers. Catherwood was a skilled artist and produced accurate and detailed sketches of many of the ruins and monuments, which they described in their work. The 1841 volumes were an instant success and were widely praised in the national press. The two travelers returned to Yucatan for a second expedition in 1841 and 1842. In 1843, the following year, they published a second set of volumes entitled Incidents of Travel in Yucatan, describing their discovery of 44 previously unknown sites in the region. In 1844, Catherwood published yet another volume, Views of Ancient Monuments in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, which consisted of 25 of his own hand-colored lithographs interspersed with his own commentary. Like the 1841 volumes, these subsequent books received wide acclaim. Encouraged by Joseph Smith's interest in these discoveries, Latter-day Saints also greeted these volumes with enthusiasm, in large part because of their potential relevance to the Book of Mormon. Catherwood's skillful drawings of Central American ruins and monuments provided, for the first time since the publication of the Book of Mormon, a comparative real-world picture of what Nephite cities and monuments could have looked like. Stephens and Catherwood provided Latter-day Saints also with a useful rebuttal to those who claimed that Native American peoples were incapable of the kind of cultural achievement described in the Book of Mormon. The volumes also provided valuable historical information on indigenous people of the region, which were previously unknown to the saints. The influence of these books can be also seen in early attempts to make sense of the geography of the Book of Mormon narrative. My purpose here, and I realize, and we talk about these early interpretations, we would probably, most of us or some of us would look at some of these things a lot differently today. So my purpose today is primarily descriptive, and it's not to assess the validity or invalidity of these specific interpretations, but rather to describe how Joseph Smith and Latter-day Saints in Mormonism's second decade attempted to incorporate what they learned about Central America into their understanding of the Book of Mormon. And in my paper, I will try to address each of these points in greater detail. These are, by the way, two of Catherwood's drawings. They've since been colored in, but they're really quite nice. In September 1841, John Bernheisel, a recent convert then serving as bishop over the saints in New York City, purchased a copy of the two-volume work. And on 8 September, he wrote to Joseph Smith to inform him that he was sending a copy of the set as a token of my regard for you as a prophet of the Lord. Bernheisel asked Wilford Woodruff, who was returning home from his apostolic mission in Great Britain, to carry the set back to the prophet in Nauvoo, which he did. On 16 November of that year, Joseph Smith dictated a letter thanking him for the books. I received your kind present by the hand of Elder Woodruff, and feel myself under many obligations for this mark of your esteem and friendship, which to me is the more interesting, as it unfolds and develops many things that are of great importance to this generation, and corresponds with and supports the testimony of the Book of Mormon. I have read the volumes with the greatest interest and pleasure, and must say that of all the histories that have been written pertaining to the antiquities of this country, it is the most correct, luminous, and comprehensive. The letter shows unequivocally that Joseph Smith shared the excitement of these other brethren about the discoveries generated. The letter shows unequivocally that Joseph Smith shared the excitement about these discoveries. Of particular interest are 5 articles that appeared in the Times and Seasons in 1842 when Joseph Smith served as editor. These articles, 2 signed editor and 3 left unsigned, promoted Stephens and Catherwood's works among Latter-day Saints. Some researchers have wondered if Joseph Smith actually authored these articles. Others have suggested that they were written without his supervision and have attempted to distance the views expressed therein from the prophet Joseph Smith. In a forthcoming article, my colleague Paul Fields and I outline reasons for concluding that these articles were likely a collaborative effort between Joseph Smith, John Taylor, and possibly Wilford Woodruff. I will not review that evidence today. It'll be forthcoming in the Journal of Book of Mormon and Restoration Scripture soon. Joseph Smith, I do want to emphasize, however, that Joseph Smith's interest in Central American discoveries encouraged other Latter-day Saints of his day to take note of Stevens and Catherwood, whose influence on thinking about the Book of Mormon can be seen in their published comments about the nature of pre-Columbian civilization, Central American history, and ideas about Book of Mormon geography. Stevens and Catherwood's incidents of travel helped early Latter-day Saints to respond to a common criticism of the Book of Mormon. That book tells of a people who had a sophisticated pre-Columbian culture. They were literate, skilled in art, built temples, palaces, and many large and populous cities. So says the text. This ran counter to the popular image of the uncivilized Native American that was common in Joseph Smith's day. While this attitude was not universal, it was an influential one, even among the learned of the day. Many Americans had begun to doubt descriptions of Cortez, Bernal Diaz, and other conquistadors who had once expressed admiration for many Aztec achievements. To some, these accounts by the conquistadors were still either unknown or considered works of unbridled imagination. This skepticism was exemplified by William Robertson, an influential historian of the day. It's often quoted in Joseph Smith's lifetime as well. While Aztecs of Mexico and the Inca of Peru were, according to Robinson, somewhat more sophisticated than the majority of American Indians, in comparison with the peoples of the old world, neither Mexicans nor Peruvians were entitled to rank with those nations which merit the term civilized. In October 1840, the editor of the North American Review expressed a similar perspective. Early Spanish accounts were highly exaggerated and could not be taken at face value as evidence of high civilization. More than 2 centuries after the conquest, the writer observed that scant archaeological evidence could then be identified that would support these early accounts. No ruins corresponding with the extravagant descriptions given by the early historians. Scholars had not found, for example, any remains of Mexican art. Some early critics of the Book of Mormon also shared this perception and rejected the Book of Mormon, at least in part on the basis of its description of Jaredite and Lehite cultural achievements. Missionary Parley P. Pratt described an 1831 encounter in which Reverend Peck, an Illinois minister, dismissed the Book of Mormon for its apparent lack of archaeological evidence. He said there were no antiquities in America, no ruined cities, buildings, monuments, inscriptions, mounds, or fortifications to show the existence of such a people as described in the Book of Mormon. According to Mormon, wrote a British critic in 1839, these Native Americans could read and write. However, when that country first became known to Europeans, the inhabitants knew no more about letters than a 4-legged animal knows the rules of logic, and not a scrap of writing was to be found. There was not, asserted another in 1840, even so much as a shadow of proof that the sciences of reading and writing and other evidences of advanced culture mentioned in the Book of Mormon were ever known here. The discoveries of Stevens and Catherwood helped Latter-day Saints to respond to such criticisms. The September 15, 1842 issue of the Times and Seasons printed extracts from Stevens and Catherwood's account of the ruins of Palenque in Chiapas, Mexico. The article noted Nephi's construction of a temple and other buildings in the land of Nephi and compared these to Stevens' ruins. Along with the explorer's description, they gave some commentary as well, mentioning cement buildings, carvings of what appeared to be individuals of a royal court, and numerous hieroglyphics, which probably give the history of these incomprehensible personages. A subsequent article for October 1st referenced the Book of Mormon account of the discovery of a large stone with engravings found by the people of King Mosiah in the land of Zarahemla. It then compared this with the ruins at Quirigua, where Stevens and Catherwood found numerous carved monuments and a large round stone with sides sculptured in hieroglyphics. Following their description of the previously unknown site, they concluded, "Of one thing there is no doubt." This is Stevens and Catherwood. "Of one thing there is no doubt. A large city once stood there, its name lost, its history unknown." The Latter-day Saint writers of the article were tantalized by the correspondence. Although they stopped short of equating the site with the Book of Mormon city, "We are not going to declare positively that the ruins of Quirigua are those of Zarahemla. Still, it will not be a bad plan to compare Mr. Stevens' ruined cities with those of the Book of Mormon. Light cleaves to light, and facts are supported by facts. The truth injures no one." Critics countered that Joseph Smith could have known of Central American ruins prior to the publication of the Book of Mormon. As one opponent wrote in 1843, "If Mr. Stevens did not visit Central America before 1840, extensive ruins were known to exist in Guatemala, Yucatan, and Chiapas long before that period. Even as early as 1787, the ruins of Atulam, a city built of stone, 32 miles long and 12 miles broad," there was some exaggeration in the descriptions, "full of palaces, monuments, etc., was discovered and surveyed by Captain Del Rio, and a description of it was published in English in 1822. So, the existence of such ruins were known long before the publication of the Book of Mormon, and the writer of that book, being acquainted with the fact, all he had to do was to accommodate his description thereto." So there it is. In 1849, another critic responded to Orson Pratt similarly, claiming that the existence of those ruins discussed by Stevens and Catherwood was known long antecedent to the publication of the Book of Mormon. Others pointed to the works of Humboldt and Kingsborough as possible sources Joseph Smith might have used. This was in the 1840s. This seems unlikely, however, that Joseph Smith made use of these sources. Von Humboldt focused on antiquities of South American culture, such as the Inca and the Aztecs of Mexico in Middle America, but his discussions of the Aztecs were fairly confined. He had no knowledge of and did not discuss the ruins of southeastern Mexico and Guatemala described by Stevens and Catherwood. Kingsborough's 9-volume set was not published until after the Book of Mormon was published, and the enormous cost to produce and publish it led to the loss of his fortune and his death in debtor's prison. Even after the publication of these books, they were not widely available to American readers. In 1839, William Prescott, at work on his History of the Conquest of Mexico, wrote to a friend, "I am daily expecting from Europe the magnificent works of Lord Kingsborough. There is not a copy, I believe, in the United States." That's in 1839. Despite the increased scholarly interest in ancient Mesoamerica, writes one recent scholar, the works of von Humboldt, Del Rio, Dupuy, and Waldeck, these who wrote on the ruins of Palenque, had remained relatively unknown to North Americans in the 1820s and 1930s. Berthold's 1822 repackaging of the Del Rio expedition, for example, had failed to find a general audience even in London. And while the enormous cost of Humboldt and Kingsborough's and Barteret's and Waldeck's works effectively prohibited their purchase by more than a handful of wealthy European antiquarians. Produced in multi-volume editions with hand-colored lithographs, the works often commanded prices of several $100s per volume, resulting not only in their limited circulation, but also in some cases the financial ruin of their publishers. To illustrate this, in 1840, an American reviewer of the Dupuy and Castaneda work on Palenque, this is one of the sources that the critics said Joseph Smith could have used, since it was published in 1822. In a review of this, he said, "Here is a work exceedingly interesting, as is evident from mere perusal of the title page, to every American. And yet we think it possible that there are more persons in the United States who have visited some of the monuments described in it than there are who possess the work describing them. Only one copy, as far as we are informed, has reached this country. To us, therefore, this is a sealed book." It's an interesting phrase. If such can be taken as an accurate description of the availability of sources on Central American archaeology in 1840, it seems highly unlikely that Joseph Smith and his earliest associates were aware of, much less influenced by them 10 or more years earlier. I'm a little bit behind here in my presentation. The value of Stevens and Catherwood's works was not limited to the discovery and description of pre-Columbian ruins. These works also provided information on Central American history. In 1877, Brigham Young told his son Farah, "Read all the good books you can obtain." No fan of novels, Brigham Young counseled his son to read more history. "We should read the true and wise. The perusal of the rest is worse than time wasted. It is time abused. Sell your Dickens works and get Stevens and Catherwood's travels in Central America." I wonder if they should put that on the cover of reprints of their work. Stevens' historical material on Guatemala was dependent upon the work of Francisco Antonio de Fuentes y Guzman, from which he quoted liberally, and had material previously unfamiliar to Latter-day Saints, which invited comparisons with the Book of Mormon. One historical account describes a bloody war which was waged to avenge the abduction of the daughter and niece of the Quiche king. As Stevens told the story, "The rape of Helen of Troy did not produce more wars and bloodshed than the carrying off of these two young ladies with unpronounceable names. Bala Makan, the king, was naturally a mild man, but the abduction of his daughter was an affront not to be pardoned. With 80,000 veterans, himself in the center squadron, he marched against Zutugilebop, who met with him with 60,000 men commanded by the enemy chief general and accomplice. The most bloody battle ever fought in the country took place. The field was so deeply inundated with blood that not a blade of grass could be seen." This story reminded some Latter-day Saints, for example, Johnny Page, of the Book of Mormon account of the priests of Noah who kidnapped the Lamanite daughters, which resulted in a deadly battle. Other material was useful in responding to criticisms of the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon, for example, indicates that the early Nephites had machinery. Machinery, of course, need not be complex, but early critics were amused and had some fun with it. "What kind of machinery they had is not stated," wrote an opponent of the Book of Mormon in 1839. "Cannot be too little supposed they had cotton mills and worsted mills and steam engines to run on railways, but then what has become of them all?" One historical description of a battle in Fuentes y Guzman, which is cited by Stevens, indicates that native forces which opposed the Spaniards in Guatemala had in their camp, quote, "several military machines formed of beams and rollers to be moved from place to place to resupply weapons to their forces." And some Latter-day Saints found this useful to respond to that particular criticism. Latter-day Saints were also interested in Stevens' reports of pre-Columbian traditions that suggested possible memories of the sign of the Savior's birth recounted in 3rd Nephi. Other historical traditions seemed to support the idea that Central American peoples had Israelite origins. The king, this is one of these cited by Stevens. Let me see here. "The kings of the Quiche and Cachiquel were descended from the Toltecan Indians, who when they came into this country found it already inhabited by people of different nations. The Toltecs themselves descended from the house of Israel, who were released by Moses from the tyranny of Pharaoh after crossing the Red Sea, fell into idolatry. To avoid the reproofs of Moses, or from fear of his inflicting upon them some chastisement, they separated from him and his brethren, and under the guidance of Tanub, their chief, passed from one continent to another to a place which they called the Seven Caverns, a part of the Kingdom of Mexico, where they founded the celebrated city of Tula. From Tanub sprang the families and kings of the Tula and Quiche, and the first monarch of the Toltecs." Early Latter-day Saints took such traditions at face value. Readers today, however, may wonder what influence Spanish historians and the introduction of Christianity to the Americas had upon the description and interpretation of these pre-Columbian events. Is it possible that early Latter-day Saints, in their defense of the Book of Mormon and their thinking about that book, failed to take full advantage of the information in Stevens and Catherwood? I think so. Tending to focus on some of the more sensational things, ruins, reported connections to ancient Israel, and so forth, they may have neglected some less obvious ones and the implications that these might have for their understanding of the Book of Mormon. Consider this. The unquestioned assumption of Latter-day Saint readers throughout the 19th century, and among some recently as well, was that Book of Mormon migrates were the sole ancestors of all Native Americans, even though that idea is not grounded in the text itself. Much of the criticisms of the Book of Mormon and Latter-day Saint literature on the book has been based on this non-textual assumption of both critics and defenders. It is then of some interest to note that the Quiche tradition cited above indicates that pre-Columbian inhabitants of Guatemala and Mexico included more than Israelite descendants. But as far as can be determined, no Latter-day Saint reader of Stevens and Catherwood seems to have taken note of that point. Had they done so, one wonders if generations of Book of Mormon readers may have been able to more effectively address certain thorny historical questions that have vexed some. One interesting, though less sensational correspondence, and I need to close here very soon, has to do with the sizes of armies that are mentioned in the scriptural text, which compare favorably with those mentioned in Fuentes' History of Guatemala and cited by Stevens. This includes armies numbering in the thousands and tens of thousands, armies of 30,000, armies numbering in the 40,000s, and even forces on rare occasions said to have numbered 230,000, the size, incidentally, of the Nephite force mustered at the Hill Cumorah. Stevens' descriptions of natural disasters associated with volcanoes in Central America never seem to have drawn the attention of early readers either, which is kind of interesting. In recent years, research on volcanism as it might relate to the destruction in 3rd Nephi has proven a fruitful area of study for students of the Book of Mormon. Now, since I'm about out of time, I just want to make two comments on Book of Mormon geography. In my paper, I outline in more detail. There actually, we often talk about the traditional hemispheric geography, when in fact, especially as people learn about Stevens and Catherwood, even among church leaders, there ends up being, even though they've seen things in broad terms, there's probably several different variations of Book of Mormon geography, and not all of them agree. Let me just mention one. Johnny Page, who is one of those who writes about Stevens and Catherwood in the Book of Mormon, clearly places Book of Mormon events in Central America. He makes this one particular comment, which is interesting. All who are familiar with the Book of Mormon are probably aware of the fact that the whole account of the history of the forefathers of the American Indians, called the Nephites, Lamanites, and Zoramites, is confined to Central America entirely until the 394th page. That's Psalm 63, where Hagoth takes off on his boat. Well, in closing, let me just note that I think I'm going to end right there, rather than try to cram anything in. I think that's it.
I would like to thank Matt and Mark for what they've done here. Not an easy topic. As you all have seen, there's a lot to talk about with Stevens and Catherwood and Native American artifacts. And it plays into a lot of different questions and a lot of different issues. I'm going to confine my remarks just to a couple of things that really struck me as significant about these papers. First thing, they highlight how revolutionary, how new, maybe even how odd the Book of Mormon was in America in 1830. It presents, I think they've clearly demonstrated that the way the Book of Mormon, the setting of the Book of Mormon, these high-level civilizations in which so much of the book took place, so much of the storyline, so much of the doctrine is taught. It presents a significant challenge to what you might call the environmental thesis, what some people have. And that thesis is just simply that the Book of Mormon has nothing new in it. Joseph Smith simply pulled things from the air that were in the cultural milieu and kind of wove them all together to make this Book of Mormon. And he did that theologically and historically and things like that. And what Mark and Matt have shown is that that certainly doesn't work as far as the setting goes. Sort of the basic idea was that Native Americans were not civilized, using their language, were not civilized and had never been civilized. And the Book of Mormon, in portraying a civilization high level, really is kind of strange that way, and very much went against the conventional wisdom, and was not something that was just sort of in the air that Joseph then took for his own purposes. The interest early church members showed in things that support this high level of civilization, artifacts and the findings in Central America. It suggests, to me anyway, some tension in some of their minds. Tension between what they felt was true. They had read the Book of Mormon, and like I'm assuming most of us in here, they knew it was true. And yet that conflicted with what empirical evidence was suggesting. This tension was apparently early and long-lasting. As was pointed out, Phelps is publishing evidence for these advanced civilizations. He's getting it out to Latter-day Saint readers as early as 1833. And as both authors have shown, this interest in finding corroborating evidence, continued throughout Joseph Smith's life and beyond his life, and in fact is still going on today. The issues have changed a little bit. I don't think we're still fighting the battle that there were high-level civilizations in pre-Columbian times. I think through Stevens and Catherwood's book, and certainly, the whole field of Mesoamerican archaeology has demonstrated that was happening during Book of Mormon times as well. Today, the issues are more, horses and elephants and kurlams and kumams and things like that. But there still seems to be a tension in some people's minds that we're still trying, I think, as a people to reconcile. I also found it very significant, this is one of the points that Mark made, that the person who arguably had the most writing on the credibility and on the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, and that's Joseph Smith, he appears to have been probably much less concerned about finding corroborating evidence than others. As Mark points out, when things appeared, he would comment on them, he would sacralize them, he would kind of place them very often within a Book of Mormon context. But it wasn't something he felt compelled to go after. He didn't feel he needed that evidence. That to me is very significant. I hope everyone here will ask, why not? Why didn't he feel compelled to find evidence for a book that he produced that was so radical on the American scene? And whatever answer you may come up with to that question, I think it is safe to conclude, at the very least, that his attitude suggests a certain confidence in the book that transcended any lack of supporting empirical evidence. Considering how different Nephite civilization appeared when contrasted with early 19th century views of Native Americans, I think the confidence is extraordinary. It is almost as if Joseph really thought the book was true. For historians, this confidence on the part of Joseph translates into a frustrating lack of sources that can be clearly and unambiguously understood to represent Joseph's ideas. Let me just give you a few examples, and I think Mark and Matt have done a great job on dealing with these ambiguities here. But this letter to Bernheisel, for example, that Matt mentioned, where Joseph has received Stevens and Catherwood's book from John Bernheisel, he writes a letter thanking him. And we have that actual letter, and it's signed Joseph Smith. The interesting thing is, though, and Matt points this out in his notes, that entire letter, including the signature, including the name Joseph Smith, is in John Taylor's handwriting. And so it raises the question here, and this is one of the difficulties with this. It raises the question, does this really reflect Joseph Smith's thinking? Or did he say something to the tune of, hey, John, I owe Bernheisel a letter. Could you tell him, thank him for the books? And John Taylor sits down and writes something. And what you read in that letter is actually John Taylor's thoughts about how this book might reflect or support the Book of Mormon, and not Joseph Smith's. And it's a question that I don't know that, at least in that letter's case, can ever adequately be answered. It's something that you've just got to be aware of. There's some ambiguity right there. The Times and Season editorials, kind of the same thing. I'm very much looking forward to the paper that Matt says he and a co-author have written that will be published soon, making the case that Joseph Smith was in on the production of these editorials. This has been, if you've followed Book of Mormon geography debates, this is a battleground. Everybody, both sides, there's a million different geographies out there, and everybody kind of wanting to claim Joseph Smith as supporting their side. And so if he, did author or believe in these editorials, whatever, if he wrote them down, then that could be evidence that he supports a Mesoamerican geography. And people who are wanting to place the Book of Mormon in North America, they want to prove that Joseph had nothing to do with these editorials. And they just are, as Matt pointed out. Some of them are signed Ed, meaning editorial, not Edward, and some of them are not signed. And the point is, Joseph Smith was the editor during that time. Does that mean that he approved of them? And I'm very interested to see what Matt has on this. At this stage, without having seen his evidence, I would urge caution, honestly. I can say, just from my own experience, as an editor, I've edited a lot of volumes, and I've often published things as an editor that I didn't approve of, that didn't reflect my own ideas, and yet they fit whatever needs we had, and so we stuck them in. And so again, do those reflect Joseph's ideas? I think it would be an interesting point to note too, the same time that good old Ed is commenting on the Central American ruins, as Mark pointed out, during that same time he's commenting on North American findings, things in Ohio and Tennessee, and in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, that have now since been dated to Hopewell Middle Woodland times, which overlaps with Book of Mormon times. And so it's difficult, did Joseph participate in some of those, in all of those, which ones? It's a sticky question. And getting at what Joseph himself thought about these things does not have any easy answers. And the point here, for bringing all this up is just to see how difficult it really is understanding these things. And I just want to say I very much appreciate Matt's and Mark's efforts to grapple with these very important questions and to help us understand the beginning of what is today, I think we can fairly say, if you look at linguistics and literary things, Hebraisms, all sorts of research on the Book of Mormon, I think what we've looked at here is the beginning of what is today a veritable flood of evidence supporting the Book of Mormon's internal claims to be an authentic record of ancient inhabitants in America with roots in the ancient Near East. Thank you.